Thanks, Madhavan, and as always for one of the difficulties of speaking on Parliament is after all the great work PRS has done, there's nothing actually left to say that's new. Everything I've about to say probably learned from your work. And also, the way kind of when Madhavan asked me to speak today, the way we thought the division of labor was going to go was I'll speak a bit more generally about Parliament as an institution in the context of other institutions and perhaps wider society. And then Mr. Singh and Mr. Parna will obviously is going to speak on Parliament itself. And because we are nearing the end of this Lok Sabha session, what I thought I'd do is pose 3 or 4 provocative questions. PRS, in some senses, and not just PRS, I think a lot of the work that is being done on Parliament, both inside Parliament by very committed MPs like Mr. Singh and Mr. Panda to kind of try and reform it, to get it to work better. A lot of that focus has been on the institution itself. How can you change the rules to make it function more effectively? How can you get more committees, so on and so forth, right? But at some level, I think we have to ask the question, is there something systematic now about the way Parliament is embedded in broader social and institutional changes that is actually going to produce certain institutional outcomes for Parliament itself, right? And what are some of those linkages? Why is it that Parliament, let's say, seems to have had a different relationship, not just with society, but in a way that affected its own internal functioning in the 50s and 60s than it does now? And I think to open up that question, I'll just kind of begin with a couple of minutes of sort of a historical digression and then hopefully come to a kind of analytical point. Ever since the advent of representative government and representative institutions, representative democracy in general, there has been a big debate about what exactly does representation mean. I mean, it's not a very self-evident idea, and as anybody who knows the history of representative government knows, right? And this question is not just debated, but there is a sense of crisis around the concept of representation in almost all advanced democracies at the moment. I don't think India is an exception in this respect. I mean, you see the debates around the US legislature when Robert Dahl gets up, America's preeminent political scientist says, our legislature, our constitution is now fundamentally undemocratic. It's a really, really striking claim, right? And in the last 3 or 4 years, there has been a sense of kind of gridlock, loss of authority of legislatures across the world, actually in all democracies. Which is not to say that democracy has lost authority. And I think this is one of the distinctions we need to, as we've just seen recently, right? We have a skepticism of representation, representative institutions. Paradoxically, that has invigorated democracy even more, right, in some ways. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And perhaps there is a kind of dialectical relationship. What we are losing by way of representative institutions, we may be gaining by a certain kind of deepening democracy. But what that deepening democracy does, right, greater participation, anger, clamor, all kinds of sort of, engagement with parliamentary institutions, is it has brought out a set of tensions that were inherent in any representative government. So when we ask the question, who is a representative, or what makes one a representative, the spectrum of answers historically varies. There's the purely formal answer. Someone is a representative simply because they have been authorized by an electoral process, right? There are more substantive answers. Somebody is a representative because somehow what they bring to Parliament mirrors the wishes of their constituents. Or somebody is a representative in a more Burkean sense because not only are they authorized by the right kind of electoral process, but what they owe the people is a sense of their judgment, not a conformity to their wishes, right? So in this different conception of the roles of a representative, whether a representative is a proxy for the people, whether they are a deputy of the people, in a sense just, simply carrying out their mandate, whether they are a delegate with some independent power of judgment but somehow responsive to them, right? Or whether they are a trustee, right? Which is, they're a trustee of some conception of common good which is independent of, responsive to their constituency. The tension between these different roles is actually now coming out very starkly. And you see that in our discourse in civil society. You know, when we say our representatives are not representative of us, at one level, it sounds much less plausible these days than it should, right? Or when there was a movement criticizing Parliament around the Lokpal agitation, right? You were pitting different conceptions of representation against each other. You were saying simply because somebody has an authorization through an electoral process doesn't automatically mean they are discharging their representative function in all these other senses of the term, right? Yeah. And I think this contest between, in a sense, these different conceptions of representation, I think is a reality that I think we now have to accept. I don't think a resolution of this contest is going to simply work by claiming the primacy of one form of representation rather than the other, as Parliament coming back and saying, of course, in a strict legal sense, Parliament is sovereign, Parliament is the ultimate arbiter of our democratic differences, right? But that conception of representation, the member of Parliament as a proxy, right, cannot do away with the moral legitimacy of these other ideas of representation, right? And I think we're in this interesting sort of moment where I think members of Parliament, many of them are actually struggling to figure out what their actual role sort of is. Particularly because, as many of you as PRS has kind of often pointed out, there's also this deep disjuncture between what it takes to get elected at a constituency level, right? What do you have to do to be an effective member of Parliament in a Lok Sabha constituency, and the legislative function of Parliament. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a kind of a close connect between the two, causing a deep confusion in actually what the identity of a legislator is actually supposed to be, right? This identity or this fundamental dilemma has been, of course, further compounded by an institutional feature, again, PRS has talked about, a lot of people have been talking about it, which is the excessive, as it were, centralization of our party system. And I'll just kind of make up one or two points about it and then come to the larger analytical point. One of the unintended consequences of the anti-defection law, as we know, was to basically do away with the bargaining power of the individual MP in any party, right? In the last 20 years, it's fair to say that most party systems have become more centralized rather than less. We used to talk about Indira Gandhi having a centralized party system, right? But actually within the party, she had more checks and balances, in the sense that there were at least 7, 8, 10 major regional leaders who, if they walked out, would make a huge dent to the party. One of the big changes that has happened is that most parties have, in a sense, become more presidential internally. And the MPs within that party have become more atomized individually, right? Even MPs that actually come from traditional social constituencies or actually families, right? So you have this kind of paradox where parties are much more dependent upon central leaderships, right, than they, in a sense, have historically been. And a lot of MPs across political parties are perhaps amongst the most marginalized people in this representative process. I think we have to acknowledge that. It's, in some senses, they are victims of this party centralization, and the fact that the anti-defection law has given them no leverage, lack of intra-party democracy has given no leverage to them to actually put pressure on their leadership. Now you add all of this up, and you end up with, I think, what many people feel is the nature of party. Lord Hailsham once described the House of Commons, the British parliamentary system, as an elective dictatorship, right? And it was a very, very striking claim to. But if you think about it, he had a point. I mean, his point was simply that in a Westminster-style government, right, because it's structured along party lines, and if party leaders exercise the kind of control they do, right, essentially the legislature is, at the end of the day, irrelevant. Okay? I mean, just putting it much more. What keeps the House of Commons relevant, right, in some ways, is not the objective structure of the distribution of power. That's very much in the kind of party hand. But a very strong commitments to norms, conventions, right, that seem to operate independently of the incentives of individual MPs, right. But if the House of Commons was an elective dictatorship, right, then what are we, right, in some ways? Now, here comes, I think, what's the troubling part, and this I hope to provoke you. If structurally parliamentary government has a tendency to a kind of elective dictatorship where the legislature becomes a kind of, a footnote to the executive, as was frankly the case in those golden eras that Madhavan was talking about. That was the flip side of it. Wonderful internal working. But at the end of the day, right, the legislature was the footprint of the Congress party or the executive. What recourse do you have to actually stop this elected dictatorship from running roughshod over us, right, in a majoritarian parliamentary system? The one safeguard we have had, unwittingly, is of course the Rajya Sabha. And Rajya Sabha's function historically has turned out to be to slow down the wheels of takeover by any government, right? That's basically the Rajya Sabha's big check and balance function. If you don't have that function, how do you actually slow down an executive? And you may have very good legitimate reasons for wanting to slow down an elected executive, right? Only way you can slow down the executive is by disrupting parliament, right? Okay. So now comes the interesting question, which is, when do parties decide it's their interest to be disruptive? Now, the argument I'm making is that this mode of trying to slow down executives by disrupting parliament is going to remain a permanent feature of our parliament, because it's now structurally inbuilt in the character of its working. The only question, therefore, we need to ask, or the question we need to shift is, on what issues do political parties decide to use their power of disruption to halt parliament, right? That they will use this power, and probably after the next election it may increase. I mean, we were joking whether, we don't know the outcome yet, but are certain opposition parties going to be more disruptive than others, right? But I don't see any institutional feature that will not only take away this incentive for disruption, right? But you could actually argue this disruption has been the only safeguard of our liberty and, as it were, bulwark against executive majoritarianism. And I think this is a question we'll have to confront, whether the counter-reaction to elective dictatorship, right, and I'm putting it a bit more simplistically to kind of provoke, is going to be a kind of perpetual veto, right, through the power of disruption, right? And I do think we need to there's no easy answer to how we actually get this balance right. Been scanning the literature on parliament. It's not as easy a question to answer as we, suppose tomorrow parliament, majoritarian government brought bills, that were violating various rights. That were ominous to our liberties in some ways, right? Sure, the Supreme Court might save us and so forth. What tactic would a minority use in that parliament to slow it down? We use disruption. Okay? So the question then is, I think, on what issues do we actually use disruption and what we don't? I think the trouble is, and the fairer criticism, I think, of the parliament is not that disruption is being used, but it's being used so indiscriminately on almost every single bill. The kind of the list that Madhavan read out, right? And the question is, can something be done to create a political consensus, right, to, as it were, protect some of these bills from this kind of power of disruption that I think is now inherent in Parliament, right? Under what conditions can that actually be produced? Now, I think the answer to that question, unfortunately, doesn't lie in Parliament, right? I think it lies partly outside Parliament in the sense that, I think as we saw in the last session, there was beginning to be a sense in both BJP and Congress that disruption of Parliament had gone so far that if there were no legislation in the last session, it would actually only deepen not just the skepticism of representative institutions, but, play straight into the hands of entities like the Aam Aadmi Party, right? In terms of legislation passed, last session was a glorious session. I mean, just think of the number of important legislations passed. Whether you agree or disagree, we can talk about later, right? But one of the things that was a catalyst was this incoherent judgment call that somehow the quantum of disruption has reached such a magnitude that the backlash against Parliament will become deeper, right? And the question is, how are political parties going to actually make that determination, right? How do they come to that judgment that it's going to be costly for them to disrupt Parliament, right? Now, the difficulty in our system is that it takes a small party to disrupt Parliament. I mean, anybody with 5 MPs can in the well, sort of, right? But I suspect if you are thinking about the improvement of Parliament, this relationship, where political parties internalize that collectively to them there is going to be a major cost to disrupting Parliament, right? I think this is going to actually determine the future of how Parliament works more than the kind of smaller institutional reforms, right? I don't think there is an easy internal institutional reform that is going to, as I said, take away this, this weapon we had. And in some sense, Parliament works like a good, sort of what used to be the old caricature of a good kind of panchayat democracy, which is there are, again, the paradox of India, despite all these disruptions, when things happen, it happens because of consensus, right? Majority votes have become less, voice votes have increased, right? So we kind of oscillate between it's either consensus or disruption, right? The reason is because majoritarianism, right, is actually the option that everybody finds very unsafe. Okay? The second thing, large thing I want to say, and I'll sort of end it, is I think the second big change that has happened that Madhavan referred to has, of course, been a kind of a burgeoning revolution in the principles on which government needs to run. I mean, we've written about it elsewhere, but I think right now in India there's a clamor for moving from a system of government that moves from vertical to horizontal accountability. And in that sense, Parliament will be horizontally accountable, right? Centralization to decentralization, right? Secrecy to create more transparency and openness in public information. And perhaps in the case of Parliament, I think what's interesting is, in a sense, you might say wide discretion to more public reason, right? Now, in the process of this movement, it gets reflected in 2 different ways. One, it'll get reflected in greater strength in civil society and media. There's no question about it, right? Because those express these principles of self-government much more than hierarchical representative institutions do, right? And again, this is why almost all democracies are in this big debate about how to kind of redefine the relationship between these legislations in Parliament. But the second way in which this will get reflected is the creation and increasing power of more and more independent institutions. There was a debate a few years ago, used to participate in, called whether we were moving in a post-democratic world. And I use the word post-democratic, not undemocratic world, right? But post-democratic just in the sense that you cannot only focus on representative institutions as the locus of legitimate authority, as embodying sovereignty, right? Or as the prime, as it were, forum where societal conflicts are mediated in the political process, right? And one example of this, or one manifestation of this, is the rapid multiplication of regulatory institutions and independent institutions. Not just the multiplication of those institutions, but the increase in their power, right? My colleague Navroz, of course, can put up on this occasion a really lovely chart of the multiplication of regulatory institutions in India in the last 10, 15 years. But that poses two problems for Parliament. One, which I won't discuss, which is really what is going to be the nature of parliamentary oversight of these institutions, right? And I would put, for example, institutions like the Reserve Bank in that mix, right? The nature and delegation of authority to non-elected institutions by Parliament itself produces special challenges of accountability, right? At least vis-a-vis to Parliament. I don't want to say that these institutions are entirely unaccountable. In fact, in some ways, the logic for creating these institutions is that they do become forum for public reasons in some ways. I mean, as we are seeing, actually, you can now go and question an electricity regulator, right? What's your costing? What's your kind of structure? But this is, I think, the point that Madhavan was making, which I want to sort of emphasize. The critical relationship between those institutions and Parliament, right? That relationship is going to remain very important, even though there are these pressures for horizontal accountability outside of the system. And one of the biggest failures of Parliament in the last session, last few years, right, has been a complete abdication of the function. Our constitutional framers were very sensible in defining the powers of these so-called constitutional bodies and independent institutions. If the constitution, if the process had worked as it should have in the, let's say, 2G scam or any of these other things, CAG produces a report, it's tabled in Parliament and so forth, and then, and then there's an actual discussion and a production of clarity through that public discussion, right? Our fears about the power of non-elected institutions increasing would, let's say, be much less founded. Why did the CAG have to go to the media or use the media? Why are even civil servants having to go to the media and use the media? Right? As we are seeing in Haryana right now. Right? This is a huge structural change in the relationship of these institutions and the wider public. Right? The reason simply straightforwardly is, under no conceivable circumstances can they imagine Parliament not only giving them the protection, but actually following up on what it is that they are constitutionally obliged to produce. Right? Okay. We can argue to hell whether CAG overstepped its bounds and limits and so forth. Right? But at one level, that debate is becoming irrelevant. That debate is becoming irrelevant because Parliament has rendered its relationship to those institutions completely irrelevant. That is now going to take place in the court of public opinion. It is going to take place outside of the ambit of representative institutions. Right? Because, again, because of the centralization of the party system, there is no why is the JPC produced what it has? Because it's a JPC entirely on partisan lines. Right? It's not an oversight committee. It's not a truth-finding committee. Right? So, if we are to recover Parliament's authority, this relationship between Parliament and these other non-elected institutions, constitutional bodies of various kinds, will actually have to be rethought in a very radically different way. And frankly, I actually don't see what the incentives are for doing that right now. So I'll just end with this, and this is the mischievous thought. As I said, we've had a very dysfunctional Parliament, and legislation has suffered absolutely no doubt, right? But does the dysfunction of Parliament, right, actually represent not just the deepening of democracy in some ways, but a fundamental shift in its architecture? And that if we are to recover the majesty of representative institutions, right, we won't be able to do it simply by tinkering, right, with a few internal rules and procedures here and there. Right? And I think that's the question we'll have to think about.